Thanks for coming to a conversation about civil discourse. And I'm wondering what you're hoping you're going to get out of the hour we're going to spend together. Why did you prioritize coming to this session?
This is a topic inside and outside of the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think these are just really interesting conversations around how we're communicating.
Mm-hmm. And why does that matter to you? Why does this question matter to you?
For me, in my area of responsibility, I oversee employee relations. So it's been very interesting.
Mm-hmm. I bet it has. Who else? You came to this session for a reason, hoping you're going to talk about something.
I came to get better.
At what?
At identifying what I'm not good at, and being able to identify what other people are, and put them in positions to be successful. Good. Because we're talking about something that, on one hand, is a skill, and there are definitely skills that we as leaders need to be modeling if we want people in our organization to be doing them. So I'm hoping one of the things that you're going to take from this session is some very practical things that you can exercise and make habits that will change the temperature at your organization around some of these predictable, dramatic conversations. What else are you hoping might happen in the hour we're together?
Communicating around it.
Say more about that. Communicating with whom?
With the employee groups, there's been, and there continues to be discussions, and how as leaders we communicate to our teams around the issues that are happening.
Anybody heard leaders that they thought did it wrong? Yeah, so when we say do it wrong, when we say that we're in an environment where there are conversations that are shading towards the uncivil, conversations that are damaging to relationships, conversations that are distracting to shared mission, what are leaders doing that's wrong?
Shut it down.
Yeah. And what have you seen?
That's not appropriate. Handle that outside the workplace.
Yeah, exactly. As if we could divide the energy that's actually driving this conversation from our work. So this sort of shut it down. What else have you seen leaders do that isn't working?
Well, just the opposite. Anything goes.
Yeah.
Anything goes. You're free to say whatever you want. This is, and it's sometimes from a good place. Like this is a safe space, but then that can run away in an organization that has a lot of different opinions, especially in a polarizing environment that we're in now.
Yeah, I've learned when someone says it's a safe space to ask, what does that mean? Right? Or how did it? How safe? Yeah. How did this place get safe? Right? Good. Anyone else? Something you've seen people do that we know isn't working with respect to yes.
We kind of have the opposite problem working in a law firm. There is no opportunity for these conversations, and I think as a group of lawyers, people tend not to want to engage. So I guess creating zero opportunity for these conversations.
Yeah, exactly. So let me step back and ask our collective mind here this question. What is at stake for us around this? As leaders of organizations, what is at stake for us around how we handle the way we engage these tough conversations?
Join work.
Say more.
You can have civil discourse and hold healthy tensions, and you can enjoy the relationship.
Yeah, in a sense, healthy tension. And we know this from other parts of our life, other relationships that we have. Healthy tensions are sort of the ground of rich relationships.
Yes. Getting everyone's stuff, all of it.
Yeah, let's get all of our stuff. And we're certainly in a moment in history and an economic situation where getting everyone's stuff may be the only thing that saves us.
Yes.
Right. What else? What else is at stake for us? Sorry?
Trust.
Please say more about that.
Well, if you're working with people, and it goes kind of to the intentions, is you have to be able to trust who you're working with when you disagree with them, to know that they are all working in the same direction you are, and you're not working against each other in order to create more and to do better.
And here's the hard question. What if we're not sure we're all working in the same direction? What else is at stake for us? What else is at stake for us when we think about tough conversations within an organization that we belong to? What, when you say credibility, what are you thinking?
And I'm thinking, well, internal and external perspective, so, we walk the talk.
I would also say that when folks leave our corporation, they're getting into a lot of these conversations also. And if we're really trying to take care of them and help them flourish, the way they're interacting with their family, or at least the Thanksgiving example, or at their church or their club, like that matters too, because it influences how they show up the next morning.
Whatever we're practicing at work, we're probably bringing home with us.
Yeah, and vice versa.
Exactly. And so, another moment spent engaging people with curiosity, patience, compassion, intelligence is going to generalize to the rest of your life. I've learned this from working with young salespeople who call me later not to say, oh, you helped me close a deal. They call me later to say, wow, this actual listening to what people are trying to tell you is helping me be a better parent. I think it's remarkable that that's the impact that they want to talk about. So the way that we're practicing is going to generalize, and we don't want to be doing something at work that's not the kind of human beings that we aspire to be. One more question before we start to unpack this. What makes this so hard? What makes this so hard? We're in an environment where people are easily triggered. We're in an environment where there isn't a lot of great examples being shown about how to do this well, where there's fear. What is it that makes it hard for us to make progress on this?
Our own limits.
Say more, Minnie. What are you thinking?
It forces us to acknowledge our preconceptions, our assumptions. It forces us to unpack, do it right, our emotions.
Yeah. That's a lot to expect of people, isn't it? Like Carl Jung, when he was asked, are we going to make it? He said, if we do our work. And we might say the same thing, I mean, not to be glib about it, about our companies. Are we going to be able to innovate as we need to? Are we going to be able to keep up with the demand for change if we do our work? Because employees are reporting now in studies like the kinds that McKinsey leads, that they're spending between 3 and 4 hours a week at work dealing with difficult, polarized conversations. That's a big tax. 3 to 4 hours a week. And most people are also saying that they don't feel like they have the skills to engage them. And so what do you imagine they're doing? They're avoiding the conversation, which means they're pushing away parts of themselves, which means they are not engaging colleagues who may have the other piece of the puzzle that they're trying to solve. This is a very high cost to us as a business. And as a result, we persist in beliefs about dialogue that aren't borne out. In fact, for example, if you ask most people, they'll say, I don't have these conversations because they're not productive. I don't have these conversations because they're so unpleasant that I'm just going to avoid them at all costs. And when you're not actually doing it, you're not getting a chance to test that. Whereas when you take folks and you put them in a well-facilitated conversation where they get to actually be guided in dealing with what they need to say and hear, they report that this was not nearly as unpleasant as they thought. This was not nearly as scary as they thought, that actually something good came of it. So having skill around handling these conversations helps to liberate people from a mindset that says, look, other people just have a difference of opinion. I don't want to get into it. It's too sensitive and touchy. It's too risky. I don't want to feel bad. I'm going to go along to get along. And mainly what I'm going to do is I'm going to check out anytime that I feel like there's the potential of this. So if what we really want is to get the diversity dividend that St. Marshall talked about last night, if that's what we really want, that means we've got to have habits for engaging people who think differently than us. And often they think differently because they've seen a a different cross-section of the world than we have. They're listening to different people. They have a different life experience. We don't actually get the full benefit of our difference unless we can have conversations that have, in this environment, often been primed to have a charge to them. So the stakes are very high for this conversation. What else is making it challenging for you in your workplace or you with your friends and coworkers to make progress on this? What else is making it hard? Liz?
There's kind of like a hit that you get from like being on the same team with someone.
Yes.
That like you want to sort of build off that feeling more than you want to challenge.
Us against the world, et cetera.
Yeah, the question is, would you rather go to a dinner party with a bunch of people that are going to reinforce your way of thinking or people who are going to challenge it? And I think that in this current environment, the first one sounds a little more boring, maybe even a little more stressful because of the way we try to amp each other up, but certainly safer than the kind of conversation that can happen if I actually have to deal with folks who are different. Last call on this one. Anything else that makes this challenging? It's an energy drain. Exactly. It's a total energy drain. And so, Matrice, what could possibly make it worth it for us to put up with, or to make an investment like this? What would it take to make it worth it? Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I go back to that word I used again last night, grace. Giving each other the grace of understanding and appreciating where they are in their life and their journey and their experiences. Because you don't do any of those things, there's complete exhaustion of creativity and innovation. You don't get it, so you don't grow, so you don't get money, so you don't get people, so you don't get resources, and then you can't take care of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Someone over here.
Interesting though, when it goes well, it recharges you. It even like gives you more than you put out. You just have to have that experience once, right? And then you're kind of gotten in a way.
How many can vouch for what Josh has said? I've had the experience that actually one of these.
That requires a willing, if you're going to engage in this, there has to be a willingness for change. There has to be, the concept of safe space requires a commitment to being challenged. And that that's okay. And that you may as a leader of the group, have to change. And that's a burden for a lot of people, is that recognition that we're going to have this civil discourse, that we're going to have this environment, but that may mean that I'm wrong. Yeah, that's a big hurdle for a lot of people.
And that challenges power.
Yeah.
It does challenge power, doesn't it? Yeah. When power is predicated on being right, when power is predicated on getting your way, when power is, in an ugly way, predicated on other people having to back down or admit they were wrong, or just to be beaten, or at worst, humiliated, then that's not civil discourse in any way. In fact, and it's very dangerous. So we're talking about a practice that is going to look very simple, but it's going to be grounded in a larger intention and a commitment that our organizations have got to prioritize understanding over solving. That's going to be the watchword today. What I have learned in my practice with companies, in education, and in my work with nonprofit organizations and spiritual communities is that those that are able to sustain a practice of civil discourse do the work culturally of separating these two tasks, understanding from solving. Most of the urgency that comes into these conversations comes when I'm afraid that right now what I'm doing is I have to persuade. I have to lobby. I'm about to lose something that's important to me. I'm about to lose power. The decision is going to go the other way.
And the decision is being made soon.
The decision is being made soon, perhaps even in this conversation. And if we're in that conversation, then I have to be defensive or offensive or aggressive. And so the question is, what does it take to separate the work of understanding from the work of solving. Because let me give you an example of what I see organizations doing that are doing this at a very high level. Because the skills I'm about to describe that can help, that we as leaders can model, that can generalize in our organizations, depend on this view of the world. We are in a diverse organization that we have worked very hard to get different perspectives around the table. The insight from that does not come for free. In fact, having diversity around the table actually makes the problem more complicated. Because if I'm still in power solution mode, I now have more tribes represented around the room. And my anxious reaction to them is going to be, if he gets more, I may get less. You all may see that in your organizations. Also, what's going on when there are people around the table who look different from me or I know are from a different position in society is I begin to wonder, what's happening to my group? Is my group gaining or losing relative to... I become aware of my own identity. I become aware of my own identity relative to other people in society in this organization. And those two charges, the possibility that, hold on, there's difference here, there are teams here, and the winning trigger makes civil discourse harder. It makes it harder. So if we want to have the benefit of diverse perspectives, we've got to be really honest up front that just getting different people around the table, that's not nearly enough. In fact, that initially makes the problem harder.
This isn't the deciding meeting, or this is not the solving meeting. Like, just cut it out.
Well, we're going to get to that. I want to try to make it clear that just because you've got diversity around the table, you've actually now, unless you're prepared to till the soil in advance of that, you've made your job harder because you've now got visual signals around the table that remind people of identity, difference, potentially of tribalism, and of the possibility of losing. Lynn, raise your hand up.
I'm so tracking with you, but yes, I do have my hand up, but not for you.
Okay. Oh, good. Got it. I love that. So here's a lesson I've already learned. Not everyone whose hand is up for you. That's very valuable. Okay, so here is the next thing. The philosophical point that we as leaders want to make sure that we're making is that understanding is its own work. Understanding is its own work, and it is the work that we are doing all the time as hygiene in our organizations. And I'm going to give you some examples of what companies are doing right now to make this practical. But the expectation that when someone is coming from somewhere else, whether they have a different point of view on technically how to solve a problem on your software team, or whether they have a different view about the kind of talent that's needed in a particular position that's been created, or whether they have a different point of view about something the company is doing, that if your first response is to understand, I want to understand, tell me about where you're coming from, that is going to build the base foundation that makes for good civil discourse. And no one is going to do it in your organization if you're not. So the kind of leadership that is really critical for promoting civil discourse in your own organization starts with the question, tell me more. Tell me more about that. How did you come to feel that way? Why do you suppose this question is so important to you? What's at stake for you in this conversation? What are you hoping could happen? What are you afraid that this conversation might bring up? If we are willing to ask people those questions, and I will agree with Matrice, I think that is hard work that requires patience. At the same time, as a leader, it's how I keep growing. When my hair is on fire and I think we're under a deadline and I'm just exhausted and don't want to work on something anymore, I may have very little room to think about things like that. But as often as I can remember, Stephen Covey famously says that someone is open to your point of view the moment they feel like you understand theirs. And so this practice not only decalcifies some of the reactivity in an organization, but it also, for me as a leader, often produces the missing perspective that I'm after. So when someone is pushing something that's different, can we have a moment where we say, I want to understand where you're coming from? What does this look like to you? Why is this so important? I can tell you feel really strongly about this. Tell me more about it. Just doing that work lets off steam that otherwise will wind up somewhere unconstructive. Now, if you are having a meeting with a larger meeting in your organization about a sensitive topic, and you are afraid that there's going to be all kinds of triggers to it, I highly recommend, because I see this successful, having 2 meetings. The first one is the discernment meeting. And the only purpose of this meeting is to complicate the question you're asking. Literally, let's talk about this question and what's at stake for us. Let's think about all of it. It is not a solutioning meeting. In fact, in the first meeting that I've led for organizations that have told me, I'm not sure we can talk about this, we don't even talk about potential solutions in the first meeting. We just talk about what is challenging about this question for us. Why is it so important? What does it look like to you? What does it look like to you? And I tell people before they come, or the CEO tells people before they come, this is our discernment meeting. We will not be making any decisions here.
And I love that word complication, because instead of like narrowing down and quickening, it's like, let's make this worse in a way, right? Let's appreciate all the contour and make it even harder. And for whatever reason, that's really satisfying. I've done that with you. I love that word.
For the Matrice?
I have a question for you on that. So many executives have different personalities.
Yes.
Right? And, that personality of that executive in those hard-charging companies where they're just constantly running fast, how do you get people comfortable to be in a meeting where you're just talking about the challenge without them basically saying it's a pitching session and they don't want to be a part of just hearing about the pitching, but they'll come to the meeting when you're done?
Yes.
How do you manage that?
I think this is a fantastic question. And to me, the idea that I don't want to come to hear people bitch, that's a frame, that's a story. And so the challenge here for leaders is to ask, when I'm dealing with someone that I know is hard charger, not a listener, and inclined to be reactive and feel impatience and urgency, I start by asking this person, what's the outcome you're hoping to get? And what are you afraid is going to happen? And then I can say to them, here's what's likely to happen if you try to force a decision in this meeting. Or ask them, what do you imagine will happen if you shut people down? What's going to happen? To get them to be mindful of the thing they don't want to have happen. And then to say, I want to ask you to take a risk and trust me on this. We're going to have 2 meetings. And here's why we're going to do the first one. We're going to prime people so that when they show up, they're not just complaining. It's really critical. You win this battle in the way you frame the meetings for the people who attend. You tell the people who attend, there is going to be a decision made. And the decision is going to be made in this second meeting. The decision is going to be made. What we're doing in this first meeting is not persuasion. And I like to say, if you think about the things that need to get done in order for this to work, the first is just discovery. We need to hear the different perspectives. So we're not going to ask people to come and complain. We're going to ask people to come and say, we're going to give them some prompts. Here's a decision the company has got to make. Here is an urgent situation that we're facing. What we need to hear about is, what does this look like to you? If you're trying to help us make a good decision for the team as a whole, what is the piece of the puzzle that you have? What do you see that no one else is seeing? Or what is it that is a value that's at stake for you that needs to be considered as we're thinking about this decision? And I often write in the notes to people, the final decision will not please everyone. This is not an occasion for you to come and lobby. This is an occasion for us to be smart together. And most CEOs, if they're going to spend an hour with a group of people in a conversation like this, would like to do it successfully. So you can prime them and say, here are the questions that I would encourage you to ask. Here's how to follow up. Or maybe you go with them to facilitate and they sit with you. Here's your role in this conversation. But understand, what we're doing in this hour is, if you will do this with me, you're going to get ideas you didn't have about ways to get to a more graceful, a more solid, sustainable solution. And Matrice, it's been my experience in the times that I've done this with leaders that didn't want to do it, that what they saw was something that actually opened a door to something that it was an option they hadn't considered whenever they saw how the pieces could potentially fit together. Am I making sense? So I think what we have to offer them is to say, the way we're working right now, if we keep pulling gas into this, it's going to make it worse. Instead, let's try this, and we're going to have a meeting that's just for this. Then the next meeting is going to be one where we try to articulate what does the puzzle look like. So these are the competing goods that we've identified that are at stake in this conversation. These are the places where we've got tension that we need to try to come up with creative ways. The third is we consider possible solutions the third time, right? And then finally, the fourth meeting, we make a decision. If you can slow a conversation down to the speed of this conscious choice, by the time you get here, the relationships are intact, even if some people haven't gotten what they wanted. And even if some people are still angry, upset, hurt, the relationships are still intact because nothing is happening fast enough that is prioritizing something over the relationships. Stop here for a second, see what's coming up for you before we talk about practical things.
I feel like our organization, I just worry that employees don't want to give us this much time. So when something comes up, there's like a feeling of like a need for us to immediately react.
Yeah.
And so this feels really good, and yet I don't, you're mentioning a leader wanting to push, but I feel a lot of pressure from employees to sort of immediately come up with a solution or an engagement or something. And we do try to have some of this, but there's a lot of like, you should have a statement, you should have a stance, you should have a something ready to go, like, and so how do you deal with that sort of pull from the judgment from sort of the whole looking for you to like have this ready?
I'll give you my understanding from observation of this. A lot of that urgency comes from the top. If your leaders believe that thinking carefully and listening patiently is a waste of time, then people are going to, even if in their heart and at home they wish they were that kind of person, they're not going to believe they have permission for it. And so it is a big deal for leaders to give the members of their team permission not to move immediately to solutioning, not to move immediately to fixing, and to say, and listen, I think this is where our faith drives everything that happens at a company. If you really believe, if you're deep faith, if you really believe that this is a waste of time, then you're only approaching civil discourse as a compliance program. Everybody smells the phoniness of it, and it will do more harm than good. And if you as a leader are willing to test the possibility that, in fact, people can be smart together and relationships can be deepened by this kind of learning together, and you say, look, I haven't been very good at this as a leader, and yet I'm realizing this is what's missing, or I'm going to try this. I'm going to try this with you. My confidence is that your employees will give themselves permission to try it. Employees typically reflect the priorities that they hear from their leaders. And so if your leader says, we are going to slow down the conversations where we are unintentionally, habitually stepping on each other, and instead experiment with being smarter. And people might grumble, oh, is this real? And if I've got a bad track record of trying to roll stuff out that didn't have any depth to it, then I'm going to have to prove it. But my confidence is the employees will follow if the leaders lead. Josh, please.
I've seen you do this. First couple times pretty slow, then they speed back up. And so it gets back to a place where it's speedier than you think because you begin to internalize the processes and it starts becoming natural. And the organizations that then get in the habit, like it's not weeks and weeks or lots and lots of meetings or endless doodles being passed around. Like it starts to catch back up once you build the muscle memory.
The other thing, and I'll get your opinion on this too, is I've
That's right.
If you can slow down and do discovery and puzzle and solutions, whatever labeling, we use inquiry and advocacy are our two words. This is an inquiry meeting. We're here to learn, we're here to ask. Advocacy, this is here to advocate for your position. And then a leader who is responsible for that decision will ultimately decide. But the emphasis on relationships is so important. But for us, what we've done is we've done this in lower stakes environments so that when it comes time for a higher stake conversation, the muscle is already built. And, finding the right thing, sometimes it's, we don't have a vending machine, but it's, what do you want in the vending machine, right? So it's just so low stakes that it just starts the muscle building of inquiry and advocacy for us. Is what's good.
I've made the error of using it as a technique and not really being objectively curious.
What happened?
That's damaging.
What happened when it was damaging? What,
People feel it. It's like, okay, we're going to go through this process. I'm going to ask questions, but I'm not really curious about your answers. Now you all got to that, and here's what we're going to do.
exactly.
And that's more damaging than just give a direct. Don't do that.
A really fun exercise to build on both your points I did once was the group just had to order pizza and beer. We had to decide what it was going to be. And first of all, that high stakes problem. It's sneaky. It was really good practice actually, and people really got into it about the pizza and the beer. It was the whole thing. And it gives you that crucible, that trial, that workshop environment before you then start rolling it out in the real world, right? And so it helps you work on your curiosity too. Why do you like mushrooms on pizza? Tell me where you're coming from on the mushrooms thing. And it's like, it really helps actually for the leader too to break the seal and kind of get that out of their system in some playful environment first.
So let's think now about applying some of this in the context of work. What is an example of a kind of conversation that could be in your workplace that is not staying civil, or one where there is a high threat level of this damaging relationships or sending people to their corners?
We can give one. Economic alignment, right? We're in a business that's, most people are type A and incredibly insecure. And they define generally the realm possible based on their own individualized horizon. They never really think about, what is the duration of this business, what's the apex of this business. And so there's a tendency on some of them to really think about short-term only, which can hold the opportunity set far.
Yes, yes.
And so what they'll then do if they're in charge of a particular revenue stream, they'll behave in a way that will think about solving what's in front of them only, irrespective of what's damaging to others around them in terms of what the longer-term goal is. And yet they're all, the aggregate team can sometimes not feel necessarily safe around defining their personal, professional, financial goals, which will evolve over time. And so you get people who will say things over email, right, which is not the right forum for every particular thing. That can create stress on the rest of the team, on the rest of the unit, and then it's very hard to get people to engage in a conversation about, are we truly aligned economically in terms of how we're doing, or are you trying to grow your revenue unit side in a way that's detrimental to someone else's?
This is really great, isn't it? Because this is a high-stakes conversation.
Incredibly high.
If there are folks who want a short-term payoff from this enterprise, and I'm somebody who's in it for the long-term development of my career, including my reputation with people that we're selling stuff to, right? And you're asking me to maybe push imperfect products out the door faster to turn sales, when I'm actually going to be, I've got another 20 years of my career, and I don't want people remembering me. That's not my integrity.
Yeah, and candidly, the reputation damage and impact can happen to the person you just hired as a brand new person, and you've got a responsibility to help them achieve their goals. And you can't do that if you've got reputation risk and damage because everything else is a short-term, immediate impact.
See, I love this. So this is a really wonderful conversation. And so what would happen? What would happen in this case if the manager who has hired this person came to the person who's pushing the short-term revenue goal and said, let me tell you about the commitment we've made to our new hires?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we're going through this process right now. It's taken probably 2 years even to get to the discovery meeting, because people are terrified of what the implication might be if you have the conversation
Yeah.
And what we also see, and people are just product of their own experiences, right? But what we see is some people conflate business goals with personal friendships and let one impact negatively the other.
Great. So look at this. This is to me part of having civil conversation about highly charged, predictable dramas of business. Part of the value of this is just having these questions that are recurring for everybody painted on the wall somewhere. How are we thinking about this trade-off? How are we thinking about the way these things, so that we can get because in order for me to be successful at your organization, I need to be aligned on these sliders. And if someone wants to tell me, we're creating value for the long term in your career, but what I see them doing is this, then there needs to be a place for me to point to say, let's go back to how our company has struck the balance on this particular predictable trade-off. So before we get to, one of the aspects of civil discourse is asking what I would call the prompting question that raises a shared value. And the prompting question in this case is particular. I want to make sure I understand how we're trading this off right now. And if they say, well, sure, we're still a long-term company. What cost do we expect to be imposing on our junior people's reputation from this? What cost are we willing to impose on their reputation to reach this goal? These are questions that are actually, we don't know the answer to them. We have to ask our leaders that. So part of civil discourse is the courage to raise up, and if these things haven't been clarified before, then it's going to require like a huge stepladder of courage to get them. But I'm saying when I go in to sit down with an organization for the first time, there are like 3 or 4 things that are the usual high-stakes triggers of imbalance or misalignment between people in different parts of the organization that we just need to have painted on the wall so that we can know, all right, what's happening with this right now? What's happening with this right now? Am I making sense? And so then I want to go back then to civil discourse to me often begins with a question that is open-ended and prompts a shared value. Minnie and I got to be involved with a team that did a study about the effect of phone calls on people's experience of loneliness. And the way our callers engaged people was they asked open questions, they listened to the prompts or the clues that the other person was giving them, and they only made 1 point per turn. Rather than advocacy, they just made 1 point per turn. And the result was there was a measured decrease in the experience of loneliness, which is not typical of these sort of phone call studies. So there's a way of engaging people that lowers the adrenaline and the temperature and signals belonging to people. If you make 1 point per turn and are willing to hear what they say next, that affects their local mental health, perhaps. If you listen to what they just told you and are curious about it, follow their clue, yeah, well, that would be challenging for my so-and-so. Tell me about that challenge. What's challenging about that? That is going to have an effect on the temperature. If you ask open questions that you don't know the answer to, instead of closed questions that are designed to corner and trap people, that affects the temperature of the conversation. So these are sort of micro practices that we as leaders can learn. And I find it's very effective when I'm trying to start civil discourse to ask a question that I don't know the answer to, which is, how do you imagine the experience is like for this person? Eugene was having a very tense argument on social media with someone, yeah, well, I'm going to tell the story anyway. So with someone who was saying that there's no racial issues with policing. And Eugene asked this person the following question. What are your friends who are raising black sons, what are they telling you? And that was a beautiful question, I thought, because he didn't know the answer to it. He didn't know the answer to that question. And the question prompts, it brings something into the room that you can be both curious about, and it points at something that is actually part of the conversation that's been neglected. Am I making sense? So what I would ask your leaders is, how will this set our junior people, how is this going to help our junior people build the reputation that they need, that we've promised them they can build here? How does this help us deliver on that promise? Okay? Anybody else have a difficult conversation at work? You came in here because you're thinking about conversations that can become uncivil. What's an example that you all have right now? Yes, sir.
We're preparing for a retreat this week, later this week, and we're going to have a conversation about isms, racism, sexism, such, because it has come up in our field of work a couple of times.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, we are a collection of civil rights lawyers who are internally looking at this as a challenge for work.
Yes.
So that's a conversation that we're preparing for.
Yeah. And what do you imagine, what's the threat or the risk in this conversation that you're concerned about?
It's a couple that I found out. One is this fear of if I state my opinion or my stance on any one of these isms, then I'll be fired. Or I'll be looked down, or I'll be judged, or there's going to be a ticket on my head.
Yeah.
On my head.
Size on my end.
Yes, yes. So that is one. Two, because of the remote work, because of the already existing disconnect between the people, there will be further disconnect if certain opinions or certain standpoints come up.
Yeah.
So it has been a hush-hush issue that is lingering, that is there, that everybody can at some point out to directly have felt it or indirectly. But the fear to have this conversation in that manner is so powerful that it's been kicked down the line till now. We're going to have this conversation, but
Yeah, this is good. This is good. Because look, any of us who does not feel welcome to bring all of ourselves to work is holding back something our company needs for its mission to be successful. And so how do we have that conversation when it's likely to become uncivil because people get defensive? If I hear you had an experience of not being included or an experience that was directly counter to belonging in this organization, I might feel like I need to defend against that or argue you out of it or make you feel good or whatever. And to me, this is a very difficult conversation to have in a group this size. So one of the things that helps promote civil discourse is to break the conversation down into a smaller group and to ask, for example, your team to say, in the next week before we come to this meeting, talk to 2 of your colleagues and ask them these questions. When did you feel most wholehearted in contributing at work? When were you invited? When were you wholehearted? When did you take a risk? When did you feel like it was safe to contribute at work, something that you might otherwise not do? When did you have that experience? And when were you blocked? When did something happen that signaled to you that your contribution was perhaps not welcome? And I would do that do a walk and talk with a couple of people. And then when you get into the big room here, I don't have to put you on the spot. I don't have to put you on the spot. I don't have to be on the spot directly. I can say, here are the things I heard in my conversations. Here are the things that I'm aware are happening. Here's what I learned from listening. And then the guide that I give people for this exercise is do not argue, do not respond, do not talk the other person out of anything, do not try to make sense of their experience. Learn from them. You have one job, which is learn what does this look like to the people you're talking to, because that's all we're doing. We're not going to solve or fix anything in this meeting. We're not going to rationalize it. We're not going to defend against it. We're not going to react to it. All we're going to do is to say, how much rich data is there out there? What is the experience of the people that we're working with? And that, to me, is a way of activating this sort of slow down to consciousness approach to something that otherwise is very, very hot. Minnie?
This is about not doing something really well in this space. Like sometimes you create these discovery spaces, and there are people at different levels, and there's definitely someone with more power. So let's say you're a leader in the room with others. There are things that happen in that context where I definitely feel a tension between being open and curious and reinstating versus reinstating opinions. So, for example, the good thing is that we've created spaces that are changed the whole dynamic. So a success was that to that relational, open-ended connection space, somebody else brought a problem to be solved by the group.
Yes.
Fantastic. I mean, that was the best thing I could have hoped for. In the course of that, they shared that the partner that they were testing, whether we would continue to partner with them, was doing, I'll tell you the specifics, they're not here, but they were trying to understand and create a business to support the Mexican-American community. Hispanic, mostly in Texas, Mexican-American community. And so they were trying to get patients and do interviews, etc. And they said, well, one of the problems is they need to speak English. And I have a team where we work in parallel, and we have lots of bilingual people. We take language very seriously because it is the entry to culture, etc. So the first step was fine because we could say, well, that's already odd, probably not a partner that we're going to be working with in
Right,
the future.
right.
And we can find other ways to educate them. But as it continued, the colleagues that were sharing this somehow didn't fully understand the import of what they'd said. And I could watch on that virtual me on that screen, I could watch the faces of some of the other people on the team. And one of them asked the same question twice, which was an indicator of the hurt. Then, I could feel it, the hurt she was feeling.
Yes.
Here you are wanting to solve supposedly and build a business that will make money on this problem, and yet the partner is not. And even our colleagues weren't clicking with that. And so I stepped in too strong, I'm sure, because I couldn't let that go.
Yes.
I said, yeah, well, this is definitely a partner that we will be looking at, whether we move ahead with them. Doesn't look likely right now. And Julia, I'm feeling with you that this feels almost, and I use the word insulting. It felt in that moment. It felt
Yes.
less than
Yes.
that would be not supported. But I do feel like that balance, that it did disrupt some of the discovery, some of the openness, some of the curiosity. So I share that example because that's the reality.
I really appreciate this example, Minnie, because I feel like for most of us, the hardest cases are the ones where we are stuck between having a sort of courageous, mature hospitality and defending the folks who, because of some kinds of marginalization, we may feel like it's our need as the leader in the room to make sure this doesn't go unchecked. And we've all been in that position. And I think the idea here is, how can we, with grace, show people that an assumption that has been made, or a position that has been signaled, or a limitation or prejudice that's just popped up, how can we show people, how can we have enough grace to say, we don't have to react to that, while at the same time, this is not, we have a higher standard for this, or a more generous notion of things. And I think that one way to approach this is in these meetings to say, when someone says something like that, to say, tell me about that. And to have actually the point of view that, well, if you feel like this has to be something, I'm actually seeing it another way. We believe that to be connected to this community, Spanish is an important part of that, and bilingual connection is not impossible, and that's what we're practicing. So you have another point of view. Help me understand how you got there. And I feel like if you can meet it with that kind of grace, then what Julia might hear is, all right, these folks, we're clearly not going to work with them. Minnie is being nice to them right now, but they're going to dig themselves in deeper. And then what you're able to say at that point is, in our experience, the bilingual access is critical to building the community relationship, and I'm wondering how we might, how it could be easier for you. It seems important to your mission. And I feel like being able to have that as your first response, as opposed to having to move into what for me can feel like being the hall monitor, right, is an important option to have in our toolkit. Sandy, were you going to add here? Okay, 3 minutes. I want to try one more on y'all before we break. No one's talked about politics. I kind of thought that might come up. So someone said this at work the other day. Well, that thing on January 6th didn't really happen. Okay, now, maybe you don't know, and maybe you're not in any of these conversations, but I found this one a great one because I could just tell that something was about to blow. Right? So what happens in that moment? That's an example, right, where I was thinking to myself, okay, I'm about to teach a class on political discourse, or discourse that's civil, and here's an example of the kind of thing that right now is happening, little micro incidents all the time. So what do we do if we get something like that in the environment? Now, this is a good example of, there's really, for me in this particular case, there's nothing to debate. We're talking about a matter of fact. And yet, I've got a human being across from me that's just made a move in conversation that seems in a way designed to make trouble. It's fly paper, right? So here's what, I didn't have the presence of mind to do what my colleague did, which I thought was really brilliant. And she said, if something like that, though, really did happen, what would that mean? I thought that was so beautiful because it got underneath the silliness to the real question of value, the real question of meaning. And the person actually started talking about that. And what I realized was the person who was talking was actually afraid. Afraid. They were afraid of what had happened. And that was their only way of expressing it, was this really clumsy way that was designed to get me to attack them. Right? So there's all these brutal little games that we're trapped into right now where we get to reinforce other people's prejudices about us. I want to end with a quick story that a couple of y'all have heard. Matrice, were you going to say something?
I'm fascinated with what you're doing because there's a little bit of a notion of, what you're doing is helping a person with their issue. And so many of us have been taught that's their issue, let it be their issue, walk away from their issue because it's not your issue. And so this is a beautiful shift.
Let me tell you, I'm going to tell you where it came from, and this is how we're going to wrap. This is a story that I can't take. I don't remember making any decisions in this story. This was a moment where I was sort of possessed, but it was a gift that's caused me to be committed to this practice. I was flying to Chicago. The guy sitting next to me had 3 empty vodka bottles on his tray top, and we had not left the gate. He was wearing work denim, work boots, a gimme cap, big bristly black beard, and I started looking for something to read. And all of a sudden I heard my grandmother's voice in my head saying, "You're going to ignore him for 2 hours? You're the only person who hears what he's trying to say." And I thought, and I just turned. I had no idea what I was going to say, and what came out of my mouth was, "Flying is scary." And he looked at me like, "What the hell? Who are you?" And then he said, "Yeah." I said, "What are you scared of?" He said, "I'm scared that my kids are growing up without me." I said, "Tell me about your kids." Daughter 9 who dances, boy who's 7 who plays t-ball, baby who bangs on pots in the kitchen. I said, "You love your children." He said, "My father left home when I was 10, and I don't want that to happen to my kids." I said, "What makes you think that would happen?" He said, "I'm in North Dakota for 2 weeks at a time. I think my wife has met somebody else." I said, "I am so sorry." He said, "Oil is a dirty business." I said, "What do you mean?" "My boss is cheating us. He doesn't pay us." And he started talking about the way that the business worked. We're flying now. He'd stopped drinking. I said, what are you going to do?" He goes, "I don't know. I'm stuck," because we kept flying. And then after a while he said again, "Oil is a dirty business." And I said, And then he turned to me. He pulled himself all the way up in his chair, and he turned to me and he said, "I don't believe in global warming." And I said, "No, you don't." And then he relaxed, and I relaxed. And then he said, "My friend was killed in the oil field." I said, "What happened?" And he told me about this accident. And he told me about this man. And I said, "You loved this friend." He said, "He was a good man." And then later he said, "Oil is a dirty business." I said, "What are we going to do about all that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?" And he said, I don't know, but we've got to figure that out. And then we landed in Chicago. And I got my bag from the overhead compartment, and without warning and without permission, this man hugged me, and he said, thank you. That helped. And I said, yeah, that helped. And I went outside and cried for about 5 minutes and then went to work. I don't know how that happened. See, that just happened. But I'm saying that if we are willing to imagine that what feels uncivil is somebody trying to work something out, in many cases, if you're a powerful person, people are doing these little attacks on you to see how you handle what they're dealing with all the time. They're provoking us so that we can teach them what a civil, peaceful, gracious, smart reaction looks like. And it's like picking up trash on the sidewalk. If you're willing to do it, if you decide, then there is a possible payoff. Thank you all for being with us today. I got the signal from, anybody have a question, want to ask? Is it, anybody, anything you want to ask? Yes, Liz.
So, when you're having these civil discourses and someone really steps out of line with like a very dehumanizing comment, like,
Yeah.
are there ways that you
Totally.
put
In the moment you
that
say, if someone says something, you might say, hold it a second. It seems like, or that's personal. Let's stay focused on the task. I think that there are simple things you can say if somebody is just out of line that are a good referee check. I often say to people, let's stay away from the personal, or let's not get personal. Let's keep this focused on the task. And that's an invitation. And I think it's liberating in the same way, kids like to be given something to do that keeps them from fighting with each other. I find that employees, if they're snarling or snarky or whatever, but you might have to follow up with that person later, and then you can tell them in a way that's away from the group. But I want to check it in the moment. If someone says something dehumanizing, hold on. Let's see. But those rules need to be established in advance so people don't feel snared. When we're in the room, we're gonna be focused on the task, and let's avoid things that are personal. And let's don't make blanket statements about groups of people. That's distracting. So if you establish those in advance, then people can come talk to you about it if they need to work through it. Yeah, rules of engagement are really critical. They make all the discussions better, but they have to be established in advance. And sometimes they have to be established specifically for a particular meeting. Y'all, this was fun. Thanks.